Hey, Tony. Good day here from America. And
Howdy,
yeah,
Marty. How are you?
yeah, good, good. Thanks. Hey, today I was just reading some Gospel Coalition blogs on some of the best books of 2019. And I saw a blog post actually of best books of the decade for pastors. And it was cool to see Matthias Media had two of the 20 books listed there. So that was pretty cool. Vine Project and Wisdom and Leadership. Now, I don't think anybody needs to hear another best of 2019 book selection from us, but I do love talking about books and I love hearing what people are reading, have read, or recommendations they have. So I thought I'd just ask you a few thoughts or get some thoughts about books. And what I wanted to ask you is I'm going into 2020 looking to be refreshed with some outside of the box thinking. Uh, and I used to make a habit of trying to read a book every year that I know I disagree with. So I'm not really thinking that, but I was just curious, coming from your side of the world, maybe some authors or books that you have read in the past or that you read recently that might be of interest for me here in the US. And let me give you an example to kick it off with. Oliver O'Donovan is a guy that really has not made much of a headway amongst the everyday pastor here in the US. Should we be reading him?
If you're brave enough to, yeah, yes, you probably should.
Okay.
I've got a different perspective on reading books, I guess, just right at this moment. I've just finished 2 full-time years, some other part-time years doing a PhD thesis. And so I've been doing lots and lots of reading. And if you ask me what are the books I've read in the last year or two, many of them are somewhat esoteric and unrelated to everyday pastoring.
In
But
German.
it's and in German. But it's been a really interesting experience. The reason I did the dissertation in many ways, as you know, was to have a structured opportunity to dig down deep into some subjects and do some of the reading you don't get time to do in the everyday busyness of life. And what I've found is that at one level, it almost doesn't matter what you read, so long as you keep pursuing it and thinking about it and reading around it. So, yeah, I have been reading quite a lot of O'Donovan over the last couple of years because the thesis and the topic I've been examining is kind of broadly in the theological ethics area because I was examining the action of one another edifying, encouraging speech that takes place in the Christian community. And so to think about an action and to think about what an action means, what its purpose is, why you would conduct this sort of speech and what its purpose might be and what function it has and what its nature is and its practice is. If you think about the goodness and nature of an action, you're into ethics, you're into what sort of thing constitutes the good action. And O'Donovan, who's much bigger in our circles down here in Sydney evangelicalism than he is more broadly, say, in American evangelicalism, I think, was been as a key guy that I started to read because comes from an evangelical standpoint, very much so, very thoughtful and a profound thinker, and tries to write from the gospel and the scriptures about what it means to think about moral action, to think about ethics. And so I'd really recommend people read O'Donovan. He's very challenging to read, but that's the kind of guy you need to read. You don't need to read another how-to book that's breezy and bright and has great stories and inspires you. I mean, you can do that every now and then, and that's encouraging. We all need to, we all need to read a detective novel at Christmas time, and you all need to read encouraging, punchy, light, frothy books as well because they're encouraging, right? They're kind of like you need ice cream as well as steak. But the solid food is the kind of book that you need to mull over and that's challenging to read and that makes you stop and re-examine your assumptions. And O'Donovan's like that because he tries to and succeeds in many ways, I think, in integrating sort of a biblical theological view of the world and of Scripture with systematic theology and a really thorough knowledge of systematic theology and of ethical thought over the last 2,000 years. And he tries to integrate those things all together into a package, all centered around the gospel and around the centrality of Christ and his death and resurrection as kind of the centerpiece and meaning of history. And so he's great to read, but challenging. He's not the kind of guy that you're going to breeze through. The place to start with him probably is his sort of classic work, which is Resurrection and Moral Order, which he published way back in, I think, 84, 85. It's a second edition in 94. And it's still, um, in terms of a reformed evangelical attempt to explain what ethics is and how it works, it's certainly one of the leading works of the last 50 years, and really ought to be read. But it'll take you a while to read it.
Good. That's what I
And it'll
need.
make you it'll make you feel a bit dumb as you read it, because he'll just keep casually throwing in a reference to this and a reference to that,
Yeah.
and of course, and certain says this, and you're very well aware of that, and you think, no, I'm not aware of that. I've never heard of that in my life. So I've found digging into him in the last few years as part of the dissertation has really stretched me, and I think those are the kind of books that the kind of reading that really does you good in the end, and it's why doing this whole PhD thesis thing for me has been a very positive experience.
Yeah.
Because I read a fair bit of him, I read a fair bit of Kevin Van Hooser, that I also found I hadn't had a chance to do that, and I found that very stimulating. And I ended up reading a fair bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I didn't expect to do. Um, and I kind of had a semi prejudice against doing, I have to say, because he's sort of like in the world of theology and ethics, he's kind of like one of the poster boys. He's a really popular guy. Everyone loves to read and study Bonhoeffer because he's almost like he's this glamorous martyr theologian who defied the Nazis, and he's kind of but uh, this is
But we
kind of
don't know what to
straying
do.
off your.
We don't know what to do with him though. Like it's just when you bring him up, um, and I know he's a student of Bart, but we think about Karl Bart. Like, what do you do with Bart? You have some really amazing stuff that he said he wrote, but he has some really interesting views as well.
Yeah.
Basically, being a universalist among others, and I I always think of Bonhoeffer in that way. Like he, of
Yeah, that's right.
course, Life Together, Cost of Discipleship, wonderful reads, but he had this kind of Bartian string, among other things, that we kind of like,
Oh, yeah, very
is
much
he
so.
on our side or not? And so I've kept him at arm's length. So it's interesting. You said you've been reading a lot of him.
Well, I think that's wise. He certainly is one of those authors that everybody likes to claim for their own side, doesn't he? Like
Yeah.
if you want to go down a kind of liberal political activism kind of, if that's who you are, then the later Bonhoeffer gives you some. There's a happy hunting ground there for some stuff that makes you kind of. People are very excited about that aspect. Evangelicals tend to love his middle period, which is kind of from 1931 or 32, where he was probably converted, I think.
Mm.
There's some controversy about that, but from all that I've read and the letters he wrote and this stuff, something happened with him in the early 30s, where he quite self-consciously and openly said, "Look, everything has changed. I used to be a very selfish, this whole theology thing was just another aspect of my desire for self-advancement, but I've actually come to meet the God who is in the Scripture, and
Okay.
everything is different." And from that point onwards, it doesn't mean he's all of a sudden a card-carrying conservative reformed evangelical,
Sure.
right? He's not. But something profoundly changed for him, and in the early 30s, and Cost of Discipleship, which in the German is simply just discipleship,
Yeah.
and Life Together. Those are the two famous ones from that period, and they do reflect that. You read those and you think, this is a guy who is coming at the world and coming to the Scripture with a broadly similar set of assumptions that I do. That God is speaking through these words, and that in meditating and thinking upon Scripture, I come to hear what God is saying to me, and that he certainly believed that.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I,
He's go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the reason I ended up with Bonhoeffer was he's one of the very few theologians of any note who actually wrote anything about the topic that I was I
Wow.
was
Yeah.
researching. That's why I ended up with him. Very much not because I wanted to, but in Life Together, he discusses the nature of the one another speech, the free word, he calls it, the free word from brother to brother. That's different from the orderly word from the pulpit, the free word that brothers speak to each other in Christian community. And he talks about it quite a lot within Life Together. It's a fairly central thing. And he's one of the very few significant theologians or ethicists to actually recognize the significance of that one another word, the encouraging interpersonal word of of every Christian in a Christian community that has a really significant place within the community. And so that's why I ended up reading him and thinking about him. It very much fits into his whole theological trajectory too. It's part of his whole theology of the word, that we only come to life and are only drawn out of our inwardness and our selfishness by the word coming to us, by Christ coming to us in his word from outside and standing there and changing everything for us, and standing there between us and God and drawing us out of ourselves and liberating us. And his whole theology of the word and of salvation is then reflected in his view that that's what we do for each other as Christians. We meet each other and encounter each other, and we speak the word to each other to set each other free and be Christ to each other in that sense by bringing Christ's word to each other. So
yeah, and that's
lots of fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's essential, and I think we probably need to follow this up on a whole another time to talk about this. I would really want to tease this out some more with you and what you've been learning these last few years. But I mean, it's Hebrews 3, right? We have to exhort one another as long as it's called today, and that's a word for all of us to do for each other. But maybe just with one more minute here before we sign off. And okay, so we've got some egghead nerdy things to read, but good. We need to stretch ourselves. We got O'Donovan, even though Bonhoeffer is those books you mentioned are short. They're still substantive and take a little bit to get through, and in a good way challenging. Maybe it's interesting. Probably most of the people who are listening in the U.S. side here, I'll throw out a non-Matthias Media Australian book that I love to read with young guys, and it's a book that's out of print now, I think, but it's by Peter Jensen. It's called At the Heart of the Universe, and I just find that one of the most helpful. It's 180 pages around there, most helpful little systematic biblical theologies I've ever read. And I certainly, it's not well known here, and I think it's be good for anybody to pick up a used copy if they can get a hold of it and take a read of it. I assume you've read it.
I have. In fact, I listened to it before I read it. So it was originally given as the Moore College annual lectures here in Sydney. It was the subject of those lectures. There were 5 or 6 lectures. That's why there are 5 or 6 chapters. And I forget the year, but it was back in the 80s at some point. And his goal in that little book was to present it was an extraordinary thing he attempted. It was to present a systematic theology over 5 or 6 lectures at a level that an educated, thoughtful layperson who is part of the market for that set of lectures who would come along, and it would be at a level that would be understandable to a thoughtful layperson. But if you knew what he was arguing about, and you were a more theologically educated person, you could see all the issues that he was dealing with along the way, really quite subtly and helpfully. So it functions at a couple of levels as a book, and it's perhaps why it was never the huge success it should have been. It's not the big weighty theological tome that explicitly addresses all the issues. It addresses them along the way quite subtly. But absolutely, it's I guess the principle there, Marty, and it's sort of come out in what we've been talking about, isn't it? That the books to read aren't always the latest books. I mean, very often my 10 best books of 2019, they usually have been published sometime in the last 80 months or something. And that's great. You want to keep hearing about what's new and worth looking at. But very often there are classics and fantastic works, not just in the distant past, like reading some Calvin or reading some Bonhoeffer, but reading people like O'Donovan who are publishing at the moment but aren't as well known, or that book, which I agree as a book of short systematic theology that starts, interestingly, it starts with eschatology. It turns it all on its end. Rather than eschatology being the final chapter, it's the first chapter.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's brilliant the way he frames it that way. Reading something like that ourselves and with a few of our friends, with some people we're training, with some other, even with some other pastors, it's an excellent suggestion.
A lot of good. So before we sign up, let me get, if you've been reading Van Hooser, the only Van Hooser I've read was Is There Meaning in This Text? It took me about 6 months to get through it. It was very helpful. But if you've been reading Van Hooser, I know he's written more and more over the years. It's very prolific, and I think a little bit of interactive, very helpful. Is there any book or place to start with him?
Well,
I want the Australian giving us some, what American would you read? Or maybe on Van Hooser. Would you read Van
well,
Hooser? Yeah.
I read Van Hooser. Yes, as part of the methodological thing, especially how does Scripture, how do we read Scripture and apply it today? Essentially, that's where, and how do you think about what Scripture means and how you read it and how it affects and change our lives? And so the main one I was interacted with was the drama of doctrine,
Oh, yeah.
which is kind of his big account of how Scripture forms doctrine and how doctrine directs life. So that would be a summary of what he's trying to achieve there. How you read the Bible and see doctrinal judgments and truths arising from it and grounded in it, and what the purpose of those truths is. And very interestingly, he says the purpose is not just to construct a system of knowledge. The purpose is directive. That
Hmm.
doctrine is supposed to drive discipleship and change life. It's meant to be directive, and so that's the drama. Is not just God's big drama, like that's his way of describing biblical theology, the drama of God through history, but that it's a drama that we're players in. It only makes sense if we're actually on the stage ourselves as part of it. So yeah, it's a challenging book as well. Like and Van Hoos is very playful. He loves a metaphor and takes the metaphor, gets the metaphor between his teeth and runs. And sometimes it's hard to keep up with him, um,
But helpful, I think.
yeah,
Yeah, he's got a new
yeah,
book
very.
out on this idea of discipleship and doctrine, and I haven't read it, but it's on my list, and it's probably maybe some
What's up?
pared down
Yeah,
version of that. Yeah.
quite likely. Is that
Yeah.
Faith Speaking Understanding? Is that the one?
Yes. Yep. That's it.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I've had a quick browse through that. It's a much shorter, simpler, and it's a better introduction if you want something that's not
hmm.
as hefty as Drama of Doctrine.
And one of the things tying this up a little bit is back to life together. And I've read Metaxas's biography of um, Bonhoeffer, and I thinking about the ideal of having a bunch of guys around the table, talking theology, reading, one anothering, as you said. So maybe one of the best takeaways from this is that pick a book, get some guys around us, and get reading and talking. And I think to your point, just read and be stretched and talk about these things, and that's a good practice, in one sense, irrespective of the book. So
I think so. I think that's exactly right. Almost irrespective of the book, if you take someone who's of some value and you've got some sense that this is a worthwhile project, even if it's someone you disagree with or that
yeah,
it won't be all absolutely true, straight down the line, to get together with friends and brothers and push and pull each other and speak to each other over those texts is, I think, enormously valuable. You're right.
great. Well, thanks for your time, Tony. I appreciate it. Have a good day.